Well, hello and welcome to Critical Weight Theory. And today I'm exploring a collection of famous quotations from scientists, philosophers, writers, and political thinkers. So this might be a little bit of a fun episode. We're getting into some classic quotes. Well, also political leaders. Not everybody is necessarily a thinker on this list, but you get the idea. And some of these lines are humorous, some are profound, and a few are controversial or frequently misunderstood or misidentified, missourced, however you want to phrase that. And together they offer a fascinating glimpse into how great thinkers have tried to explain life, love, knowledge, government, human nature, all kinds of stuff. So let's start with one of the most famous scientists in history, and I've got his image as the main image of the episode. Einstein, of course, Albert Einstein. He's often associated with a humorous explanation of his theory of relativity. According to a popular version of the quote, he says this: "Put your hand on a stove for a minute, and it seems like an hour. Sit with that special girl for an hour, and it seems like a minute. That's relativity." So the line wasn't as a scientific definition of relativity. Instead, Einstein used a simple analogy to illustrate how our perception of time changes depending on our experience. And another simpler version goes, gravitation cannot be held responsible for people falling in love. That's a similar quote from him. And the humor lies in Einstein taking a complex scientific concept and applying it to one of the most mysterious aspects of human life. No equation fully explains why people fall in love, even if physics can describe the universe itself. And what about another scientist, Stephen Hawking? What are his views on everyday reality? Well, the renowned physicist Stephen Hawking once commented on the debate over free will and determinism, and this is a really good quote. I like this one. He said, "I have noticed that even people who claim everything is predetermined and that we can do nothing to change it look before they cross the road." And that's the end of that quote. So I love that one. It's like almost a mic drop kind of moment, really. With characteristic wit, Hawking pointed out the difference between philosophical theories and everyday behavior. People may argue that everything is predetermined, but they still act as if their choices matter. And you have to wonder, are they like self debunking their own premise? I don't know. It kind of seems that way almost, right? Because really, if we are like predetermined, then maybe you wouldn't even need to look both ways before crossing the street. Or I suppose you could always say, well, you were predetermined to look both ways before crossing the street, So I guess they've got kind of a way to maneuver around that observation, that attempt to debunk that premise. But still, it's a very interesting quote and it provides some food for thought. And then there is a quote that's attributed to Mark Twain, but I'm not sure that it actually was him. So he apparently is attributed as saying, "The man who does not read good books has no advantage over the man who cannot read them." And there's debate about whether Twain originated that quote, but it reminds us that knowledge requires action. The, the ability to read is valuable only if we actually use it. Access to information means little, maybe even almost nothing, if we choose not to engage with it, right? It's like it's like if you've got ice cream in the fridge, but you just let it sit there forever. It doesn't even pay to say that you have ice cream in the fridge or the freezer, I should say. It's actually surprisingly similar. And I don't know why the ice cream analogy popped up in my mind. Maybe it's because I have ice cream on the brain, like a kind of haven't had any ice cream this summer, so I just thought of it. But also because I actually did that once. I bought some ice cream, I just left it in the damn freezer, and I don't know why I didn't have it because I do like ice cream, but one time I just didn't use it, and it went bad over time, and I had to throw it out. So, uh, it's sort of like knowledge. If you don't use it, you might lose it. It's really one of those things. And what about Churchill and democracy? During the 20th century, few political leaders witnessed as many forms of government as Winston Churchill. His most famous observation about democracy remains widely quoted. He said, and this is like a paraphrase version, like a shortened version, but he said, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. So Churchill wasn't claiming democracy was perfect. Quite the opposite. He acknowledged its flaws while arguing that every alternative has proven even worse. And the quote remains a powerful defense of imperfect systems that still allows some freedom and accountability. And yes, I know the Winston Churchill hypocrisy and the fact that he actually is not as great a figure as some out there would have us believe. But nevertheless, he's got a point, I think. And even if you don't mean representative democracy, surely you would defend democracy on some level, unless you are an authoritarian, in which case, well, I have to wonder why you don't want accountability in institutions. Why don't you want accountability? Why don't you want freedom and all that kind of stuff? And you know, it's one of those things where we're going to be fundamentally disagreeing on certain things if you think that every single aspect of democracy is something foul and all that kind of stuff. So, what about Socrates? Let's look at him and a quote that may be falsely attributed to him on marriage. So that's the thing about some of these quotes, like you find them online or wherever you look, maybe in a book of quotes, and sometimes they might be falsely attributed to somebody. And that's not just true of online things, of course. It's been true that people can get things wrong even before the internet was invented. They got things wrong. So, uh, you know, Socrates was an ancient Greek philosopher. He's credited with a piece of advice that has survived for more than 2,000 years, or something like that. Maybe it was something he never actually said. I don't know. You can let me know in the comments how accurate this one is. But he apparently said, by all means marry. If you get a good wife, you'll become happy. If you get a bad one, you'll become a philosopher. So that's a little bit of a witty little comment by Socrates, or Socrates as they called him in Bill and Ted. So whether Socrates actually said those exact words is debated, but the joke has lasted because it captures a timeless truth. Life's challenges often become the source of wisdom, and if you have a terrible wife, then you're going to seek solace somewhere. You might have to turn inwardly toward your own thoughts. Is inwardly even a word? I think it is. Inward to your own thoughts, anyway. And what about Oscar Wilde? He had a number of great quotes, and I'm only going to get into a few of them here, but few writers were as gifted at turning observations into these witty one liners as Oscar Wilde. Among his most famous remarks, he said, "Work is the curse of the drinking class." I like that one. And it's because it's a playful reversal of the usual complaint that drinking interferes with work, or that working people are just a bunch of lazy drunkards. That was one of the things that classist people would say, that they would just drink away their wages and all that kind of stuff. Well, here's Oscar Wilde, who says that, actually the drinking part is the best part and work is the curse of the drinking class. So I like that. I think it's a classic quote. I don't hear it very often, but it's something that, even though I don't drink alcohol, I've never been drunk a single time in my life. But, I can understand the premise of seeking escapism. And one of the things that people do when it comes to, trying to get away from reality is they sometimes crawl into a bottle and they never want to come out again. I've known alcoholics in my life. My dad was one of them. And that's something I'm pretty familiar with. And I got to be honest, like being around alcoholics and druggies and stuff like that at times has actually been one of the main reasons I'm not one of those types of people. Not that everybody who uses a substance is a villain or something like that, but it's just not something that I've been into, but I can understand it. That's one of the great things about life is just because you're a little bit different from somebody doesn't mean you can't understand any aspects of it and all that kind of stuff. So I understand and appreciate the Oscar Wilde quote. Another classic Wilde quote, I can resist everything except temptation. So that one's a little bit sillier. It sounds like one of those, I think, what was his name? Yogi Berra. It sounds like a Yogi Berra type of quote, but I like it well enough. And one more, he apparently said, "The old believe everything, the middle-aged suspect everything, the young know everything." So there you go. So Wilde's humor often exposed the contradictions and absurdities of human behavior, which is why his remarks are popular more than a century after his death. You still hear about Oscar Wilde sometimes, and especially when it comes to anything about classic quotes, you very well might hear something from him. So now I'm going to look at two different types of quotes. One is by Voltaire, and the other is by Bakunin, and they both are regarding the premise of God or religion, whatever, that kind of stuff. So the French Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire famously wrote, if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. And a lot of people think that's sort of a profound expression. And I can understand what his thinking was at the time. He believed that God, he wasn't arguing that God was fictional. Rather, he believed that society benefited from shared moral principles, and the belief in God played an important role in maintaining social order. So, as an atheist, though, I have to disagree that it's necessary to invent a God. It's just something that happens, and the idea that religion only provides social order, I think that has been thoroughly debunked because, frankly, you could say that practically anything provides social order, even chaos. And religion is, in many ways, actually a source of chaos in the world because, for one thing, you're saying that your faith is actually something that is totally true, which is sort of an inner chaos that ends up having outer complications in the world because you're trying to run the world and in some cases micromanage people's lives based on your own beliefs, which even you might not fully understand. So how are you going to get social order out of these beliefs that are really just a matter of your faith? And the idea that there can be a true social order in the first place, that seems to me like a flimsy premise. I think by now we should understand that the main cause of social order is actually, people minding their own business other than to occasionally help each other out. Like, that is actual social order, where you mostly stay out of other people's hair, but actually, help people out when they're in a jam. It's really as simple as that. You don't need creation myths to explain anything, at least in my opinion. And that brings me to the next quote, which is by the Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin more than a century later. He offered a direct reversal of Voltaire's quote. So remember, Voltaire said, if God did not if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. And Bakunin said, if God really existed, it would be necessary to abolish him. So, quite a reversal indeed. That's because Bakunin viewed religious authority as an obstacle to human freedom. And the contrast between these two quotes, it really shows a major philosophical debate about religion, authority, and morality that continues today. So, what about Nietzsche and interpretation? That's right, I'm going to get into another philosopher here. So, Friedrich Nietzsche is often associated with the statement, there are no facts, only interpretations. Whew, that's an interesting one. And it's so interesting that I made that little sound effect there. I went, whew. I normally don't do stuff like that very often. And the exact wording is debated, like if he actually said it exactly like that, because, well, remember his original statement was not in English for the first uh, part of it, but also, it's up to interpretation exactly what his comment on interpretation exactly means. What exactly does he mean by there are no facts, only interpretations? So, I mean, I'm sure he elaborated on that a little bit more, but we're talking about these simple bumper sticker style quotes a little bit here, more than like, because I could do a whole episode on that, right? Maybe I should someday, I don't know. But really, it reflects Nietzsche's challenge to the idea of completely objective knowledge. That's what I think he was grasping at with that quote. And he argued that human beings inevitably interpret the world through their own perspectives, values, and experiences. So while many philosophers disagree with Nietzsche's conclusions, his ideas continue to influence discussions about truth, culture, and knowledge. And, it really is one of those things you have to ponder, like, what exactly are facts? And also, you have to wonder, like, even if you're looking at that quote and trying to dissect it, is he saying that interpretations are necessarily bad? That's a little bit of a slippery trick with this quote, because it might make it sound like he's downplaying interpretations as, just being things that we should be skeptical of at all times or something like that. But just because something is being interpreted through the human mind, that doesn't mean it's necessarily completely invalid, right? In fact, well, it's funny I should say in fact, but if there are facts, then we would actually need to interpret them, right? So, it really gets to that core question of what exactly is knowledge, because if you really examine even the entry level aspects of thinking, the the mind and the brain have something in common, the mind brain unity thing. And if you were to damage a person's brain, not saying you should, or not saying that you should damage your own brain, but if you were to, you might actually make them lose some of their knowledge. You might have them, forget their names. They might have a personality change. All of that kind of stuff is linked to the brain. So actually, a good part of who we are, like, well, almost everything about who we are, has to do with the physical nature of our brain. So that makes you wonder, well, what exactly is factual if so much of what I observe is being interpreted or channeled through my brain in the first place? Like, is there truly an objective truth if everything depends on my brain being intact and being able to perceive things? And then you could get into this whole sort of like the matrix is real kind of thing if you really want. Like, you could take this to some pretty absurd places if you really want to. But then again, how absurd are they? Like, if you really believe something and you're committed to it, everybody else might view you as absurd and all that kind of stuff, but to you it might not be absurd. That's one of the complicating factors here, because everything is being channeled through your own individual perception and your own brain, which of course could be significantly altered by chemistry and all that kind of stuff. So obviously I could go on and on about this, but you get the idea. So, what about Newton and humility? Isaac Newton. Well, Isaac Newton transformed science through his work on gravity, motion, and mathematics. And I'm not really that much of a science nerd, so just for the record. And he often spoke with some remarkable humility, because he was not, he kind of debunks the idea that if you're a successful person, you're necessarily confident, because he apparently was not a very confident person. And near the end of his life, he reflected, I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me. So it's like a statement of regret, it seems. Despite his extraordinary achievements, Newton believed there was still far more left to discover. And of course, he wasn't being untruthful about that. In fact, even right now, there's still plenty left to discover out there. Another famous quote attributed to Isaac Newton states, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." Great quote, really one of the all time greats. And you will find that being expressed in books of quotes or any sort of collections of quotes all over the place. You know, standing on the shoulders of giants. We've heard that expression in other places. It's actually become a little bit on the common side, and apparently this was something that originated with Isaac Newton, as far as I know. And the statement acknowledges that even the greatest breakthroughs are built upon the work of previous generations. And there's another science related quote from Darwin regarding adaptation. One of the most famous quotations associated with Charles Darwin is, "It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change." Interestingly, Darwin never wrote those exact words or said them. The statement appears to be a later paraphrase of ideas found within his work. But nevertheless, sometimes these paraphrased versions of quotes, they end up being just as good as quotes from the actual person themselves, right? And I just realized this is a bit of a sausage fest. I don't have any female quotes in this bunch, so whoopsie. Sorry for especially the hyper feminists out there who are going to be pissed off about that. But nevertheless, these are some classic quotes, and I've got another one from Franklin, and Benjamin Franklin. He is frequently credited with saying, "Beer is proof that God loves us and wants us to be happy." So another quote about alcohol. The problem is that Franklin never actually said it, at least not exactly. The original quotation referred to wine, not beer. So, uh-oh, it's a little bit of a misquote. Over time, the wording was altered and spread widely, and it serves as a reminder that famous quotations should always be checked carefully before being accepted as authentic. you know, do a little bit of fact checking and all that kind of stuff. So, it's a quote that I think beer advertisers have used, and it's technically not accurate. It is a good quote, but it was actually a little bit less of a bumper sticker statement that he made, and it was actually about wine. So I hate to rain on your parade, your beer soaked parade, but them's the breaks. That's the way the cookie crumbles. And I'm going to finish with three memorable observations about human behavior. Albert Einstein famously remarked, "Two things are infinite, the universe and human stupidity, and I'm not sure about the universe." Voltaire warned, "It is difficult to free fools from the chains they revere." And I'm going to sneak in another one from you guess who, Oscar Wilde. Well, he reminded us, "I can resist everything except temptation." Well, wait a second. I think I said that one already. Well, there it is again. I was a little clumsy in assembling these. I apparently mentioned this one twice, but I'm going to act like I did it on purpose anyway. So these are all from different centuries, different cultures, different fields of expertise, yet all of these quotes point toward the same conclusion: understanding human nature may be even more challenging than understanding the universe itself. And what makes all these quotes great is not simply clever wording. The best quotes capture ideas that people recognize instantly: truths about love, knowledge, government, freedom, belief, the human condition, all that stuff. Some are humorous, some are profound, some are disputed or misattributed, but together they remind us that throughout history, thinkers have wrestled with many of the same questions that we ask today. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson of all this stuff. While technology changes, human nature remains remarkably familiar. All right, thanks for listening, and like and subscribe. You can quote me on that.